This is Sky News Today. It's 1 o'clock. The headlines. Another attempt by NATO leaders to avert a bigger confrontation with Russia as Ukraine's president pleads for more military help.
You can give us 1% from all your planes, 1% of all your tanks, just 1%.
We'll shortly be live in Brussels, where the Alliance's Director General will give an update on any new support. As Ukraine claims its navy has destroyed a Russian ship, a diplomat's warning that Moscow could press the nuclear button if provoked.
If Russia is provoked by NATO, if Russia is attacked by NATO, I don't know. So we are nuclear power.
Also this lunchtime, the chief executive of P&O apologises to 800 sacked workers and admits breaching the law by failing to consult unions.
Can I start, please, with an apology? Actually, an apology to the seafarers that were affected on Thursday last week, an apology to their families.
The biggest fall in living standards on record, but the Chancellor insists his measures will help those who need it most. And profound sorrow for slavery, but no outright apology from Prince William as he continues his royal tour in the Caribbean. Give us just 1% of your tanks. That's the plea from Ukraine's president today as he addressed NATO members meeting in Brussels. It's been exactly 1 month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and with no end in sight to the war, Western leaders are trying to avert a possible nuclear confrontation with Russia. There are signs, though, that Ukraine is beginning to go on the counter-offensive. NATO estimates that 7,000 to 15,000 Russian troops have been killed in the past month. By comparison, 15,000 Russians died over an entire decade in Afghanistan. The UK has expanded sanctions to 65 more businesses and individuals, including the stepdaughter of the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who lives in London. And President Zelensky has called for NATO to provide effective and unrestricted support and warned that Russia had access to unlimited weapons of mass destruction.
You can give us 1% from all your planes, 1% of all your tanks, just 1%. We cannot just buy that. Such supplies depend on a political decision of NATO. Please, never tell us that our army doesn't meet the NATO standards. We have demonstrated what our standards are capable of, how much we can give for Europe's security and the world's security, how much we can do to defend the world against aggression. By the way, today they used phosphorus bombs, Russian phosphorus bombs. They killed more adults and more children.
Arriving at the summit this morning, Boris Johnson accepted that more needed to be done to help Ukraine defend itself.
We've got to step up. We've got to increase our support, and we've got to tighten the economic vice around Putin, sanctioning more people today as we are, sanctioning the Wagner Group, looking at what we can do to stop Putin using his gold reserves, but also doing more to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. That's what we're doing. We're helping free people to defend themselves, and we're moving really from a program of supporting resistance to supporting Ukrainian defence of their own country.
NATO's been clear that it will not enforce a no-fly zone, but its Secretary-General insists the defence alliance is taking action.
We are united in condemning the Kremlin's unprovoked aggression and in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are determined to continue to impose costs on Russia to bring about the end of this brutal war. We will also address NATO's efforts to strengthen our defences now and for the years to come. We are already doing more on land, at sea and in the air. This is necessary to respond to a new security reality in Europe.
We will hear, by the way, from Secretary-General Stoltenberg any minute now. We are awaiting that live press conference. And our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is also in Brussels. Very busy day, Sam. What is the latest?
Well, we're waiting, as you say, to find out what was concluded by the 30 or so NATO leaders who've been meeting this morning. Boris Johnson opposite President Macron of France, Joe Biden of the US and Olaf Scholz of Germany to find out whether or not the NATO alliance is delivering what President Zelensky asked for in that passionate address that you heard some of just now. Now, what Zelensky said was quite important. He didn't reiterate that call, we understand, for a no-fly zone. Instead, he asked for very specific equipment. 1% of your planes, 1% of your tanks is what he asked for in a video address with the NATO leaders. Now, Boris Johnson told us this morning that Britain is already stepping up to the plate. 6,000 more weapons, just under £100 million additional aid for Ukraine. And he very much, having spoken to President Zelensky only yesterday, wants to put the pressure on other Western leaders to do more. Some Western leaders more reluctant than others, particularly when it comes to sanctions. Boris Johnson making clear today that he's going after the, as it were, militia army of President Putin, the Wagner Group. Now, they are thought to be the individuals, the military force going after President Zelensky personally. Boris Johnson will call on other world leaders to increase their sanctions as well. Has it worked? Well, that's exactly what we're hoping to find out about when we get to the press conference led by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, which should be starting anytime soon.
And we will go to it live when it does begin. Sam Coates, for now, thank you so much. Let's go to Ukraine and speak to Sky's Sally Lockwood, who's in Lviv, in the west of the country. And Sally, many ears there, no doubt, will be listening in to what NATO has to announce any minute now.
Well, I think in the West, one assumes that that may be the case, but certainly from some of the refugees that we've spoken to here at Lviv train station in western Ukraine, they have far bigger things to worry about. We've just spoken to a family who've arrived here from the southern city of Mariupol, which of course has been devastated in the last few weeks. 3 generations of women from one family, a grandmother, a mother and a granddaughter. They are absolutely exhausted. We're talking about people who've been without power, without food largely for weeks now, and a lot of them have been without internet. It's not until they've got here, they've got outside of Mariupol and managed to get to somewhere safe that they've even been able to understand the sort of thing that's going on, that the capital Kiev hasn't fallen as so many assumed would happen at the beginning of this war. And so I think the diplomacy that's going on in Brussels today, while hugely important, we're talking about a country that's been through immense trauma in the last month. A quarter of the country have been made homeless, and certainly I think right now survival is their primary concern. We also spoke to a family from Kherson, a city in the north of Ukraine, a mother who's arrived here with her 3 children. And she did say, though, that she would like to see more Western support in terms of closing the skies over Ukraine, as people have come to describe it, that no-fly zone that President Zelensky has called on NATO to impose time and time again. And why is that? Well, while the ground offensive may have stalled here by Russian troops, it's certainly failed in many areas. It's not been the ground offensive that President Putin, I'm sure, imagined. Russian forces haven't even made it inside the capital Kiev yet, and indeed in some areas Ukrainian forces have actually retaken ground. But airstrikes are what is concerning people the most here in Ukraine now. You just need to look at that southern city of Mariupol, which has been absolutely devastated, a humanitarian disaster unfolding in the south of the country there. The bombings described as war crimes. But one thing that I should also mention is that we haven't yet had an air raid siren today, and I don't believe we had one last night either. the train station here in Lviv, in western Ukraine, which has seen tens of thousands of families passing through it in search of safety in recent weeks, is far quieter today. There certainly seems to be perhaps less panic in Ukraine. Perhaps they've seen that the Russian advance has stalled, has failed. There is certainly a sense of confidence here, despite the chaos, despite the trauma, and all these millions of people who've been made homeless by this war. There is a sense of confidence that Ukraine will come through this. The big question is, at what cost?
Sally Lockwood, thank you so much. A senior Russian diplomat has told Sky News that Russia retains the right to use nuclear weapons if provoked by NATO. Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, also said the country was not committing war crimes in Ukraine despite the mounting evidence. Here's our US correspondent, Martha Kellner.
This is one of very few places left in New York where this man would still be welcome. It's here at the Russian mission to the UN, where its leading diplomats write their speeches, where they work out how on earth to defend the indefensible. Vladimir Putin's personal spokesperson said that Russia retains the right to use nuclear weapons to defend the country, whatever that may be, from whatever invented
If
threat.
Russia is provoked by NATO, if Russia is attacked by NATO, I don't know. So we are a nuclear power. Why not?
You think that's a legitimate thing to be saying, though?
I don't think it's the right thing to be saying, but it's not the right thing to threaten Russia and to try to interfere. So when you're dealing with a nuclear power, of course you have to calculate all the possible outcomes of your behavior. That's what I'm going to say.
But is Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine?
I don't think we're committing war crimes in Ukraine. Of course, it's not up to me to assess. I'm not there, you're not there. You're looking at the videos, you're looking at the many of videos who are considered to be fake news.
Are you saying that the civilian homes, playgrounds, hospitals, theatres have not been targeted by Russia in Mariupol?
They were not targeted. And you know it very well. We said from the very beginning that our military is not the threat for civilian population in Ukraine.
Can I show you what the US believes is evidence of war crimes? These are pictures taken by our colleagues at Associated Press, independent news site. These are apartments on fire in Mariupol, hit by Russian missiles.
How do you know it's Russian missiles? Because there is a self-defense.
What is your suggestion that the Ukrainians are bombing?
I will tell you.
Their own building?
It can easily come from Ukraine, from the center of the city. It happened in Kharkov. It happened in Mariupol, because they have their own missile launchers, and a lot of cases that I know are reported from Ukrainian missiles themselves.
Ambassador, with respect, I think that's preposterous.
I don't know.
The idea that this amount of destruction.
I think it's quite logical. It's not preposterous.
Maybe. Mr. Polyansky may not believe Russia is guilty of war crimes, but the US says they are. The International Criminal Court will ultimately decide. But with every wild claim being made by its diplomats, Russia becomes increasingly isolated on the world stage. Martha Kellner, Sky News, New York.
Martha Kellner there. Let's get the latest analysis of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. General Sir Richard Barons joins me now. General Sir Richard, very good afternoon to you. And of course, NATO are meeting as we speak. So we just wanted to start with a little snapshot here of the the NATO members in blue, and just ask the question, what's probably top of the agenda in the discussions that they've been having over the last few hours?
So this is an emergency meeting to talk about Ukraine, and there are two important dimensions to this conversation. The most important in the longer term is how NATO now remobilizes itself to deal with Russia under President Putin in a way that is the most significant change since the end of the Cold War in 1990. And the second thing they're going to do, just as important, is talk about NATO support to Ukraine in terms of more sanctions and military support.
On the topic of military support, if we just dive in a little bit closer, but still with the NATO neighbours clearly in shot, some announcements that have started to come out, some that are expected in terms of reinforcements?
Yes, so NATO is going to affirm today it's going to deploy 4 more battle groups. It has battle groups already deployed across NATO, one each to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and they're a sign of NATO assurance and a signal that Article 5 remains inviolate.
And now let's dive in a little bit to get some perspectives of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. First of all, a focus dive on Kiev itself. And we have heard relatively encouraging stories of some successful counterattacks by Ukrainian forces in and around Kiev. Are those significant, General Sir Richard?
So they are significant, but they're very small scale. So we know of successful Ukrainian counterattacks, for example, in Irpin and Bucha, and also actually to the east of Kiev. And these are very small tactical actions, but they are indicative of the Russian forces are not breaking into Kiev, and indeed in many places are moving back a little and starting to build defensive positions. And that feels like another signal of this evolving stalemate.
Let's talk about that stalemate if we zoom out and look at all of Ukraine. We've been talking that these red-shaded areas, the land that Russia has seized, haven't changed drastically over the last week, the fourth week of this war. The stalemate, is that a very good thing for Ukraine, or does it give Russia time to refuel, both literally and metaphorically?
Well, both of those things are true, I think. I think the signs are right now that the Russian campaign in its current construction is not capable of taking much more ground, and we're beginning to see Russia dig in these defensive positions, which would indicate that it realises that. That does not mean that that will be the outcome, because Russia is moving reinforcements from across Russia, both men and material, in order to unlock that stalemate. But we're seeing not much movement around Kiev. We're seeing the battle for Mariupol, which we imagine they will in the end break. We have not seen the significant movement towards Odessa that we were forecasting a week ago, but we couldn't rule it out. And we are concerned about Russian forces moving from the north and the south of the country once Mariupol is concluded, in order to try and circle the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass. But what this begins to feel like is a war confined to the east of Ukraine, except for continuing air and missile attacks in the west on the supply lines. But this is not the war Russia intended to have.
General Sir Richard Barons, thanks so much for that summary of what's going on the ground on this fourth week of the war. The Ukrainian government says 7 humanitarian corridors have been agreed today, but there's still no safe passage out of the city of Mariupol. Tens of thousands of people are trapped there without food, water or medicine, and life is extremely difficult. Our correspondent Sally Lockwood spoke to one mother who has managed to escape.
The city of Mariupol is almost totally destroyed. In its ashes are at least 100,000 people trapped and trying to stay alive. But it's feared there could be far more than that.
Let's interrupt that and go live now to Brussels, that NATO press conference with Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg starting now.
Good afternoon. We have just finished an extraordinary summit of NATO leaders to address the biggest threat to our security in a generation: President Putin's war against Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are resisting with courage and determination, fighting for their freedom and for their future. We stand with them. President Zelensky addressed us with an impassioned message, thanking NATO allies for the significant support we are providing, and stressing the vital importance of even more military assistance. Today, NATO leaders agreed that we must and will provide further support to Ukraine. We will continue to impose unprecedented costs on Russia, and we will reinforce allied deterrence and defense. Leaders approved our 4 new battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia. These are in addition to the 4 already in the Baltic countries and Poland. So we have 8 multinational NATO battle groups now, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Across Europe, there are 100,000 US troops supporting NATO efforts, and European allies and Canada have also stepped up. We have 40,000 forces under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power. including an unprecedented 5 carrier strike groups from the high north to the Mediterranean. Today, NATO leaders agreed to reset our deterrence and defence for the longer term, to face a new security reality. On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises, focusing on collective defense and interoperability. I expect we will decide on the details at our next summit in Madrid in June. Today, Allied leaders also agreed to provide further support to Ukraine, helping to uphold their fundamental right to self-defense. Allies are also equipping Ukraine with significant military supplies, including anti-tank and air defense systems and drones, which are proving highly effective, as well as substantial financial and humanitarian aid. Today, we agreed to do more, including cyber security assistance and equipment to help Ukraine protect against biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear threats. This could include detection, protection, and medical supplies, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine, and I welcome the concrete offers of assistance made by allies today. At the same time, we have a responsibility to ensure the conflict does not escalate further, because this would be even more dangerous and more devastating. Allies agreed that we must also increase our support for other partners at risk from Russia, at risk from Russian threats and interference, including Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Working together and with the European Union, we must help them uphold their sovereignty and strengthen their resilience. We also addressed Beijing's role in the crisis. Today, Allied leaders called on China to refrain from supporting Russia's war effort. China must not provide economic or military support for the Russian invasion. Instead, Beijing should use its significant influence on Russia and promote an immediate peaceful resolution. Allies also agree that Belarus must stop acting as an accomplice to Putin's invasion. At today's meeting, leaders reaffirmed our strong commitment to NATO's open door policy under Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. NATO enlargement has been an historic success, spreading democracy, freedom and prosperity across Europe. 1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul, and we are responding. But security does not come for free, and doing more will cost more. So NATO leaders agreed to redouble efforts to meet the defence investment pledge we made in 2014. Allies will submit additional plans on how to meet the pledge in time for the Madrid summit in June. And I welcome that a number of allies today announced plans for significant increases in defence spending. At this dangerous time, transatlantic unity and solidarity are vital. Europe and North America are standing and will continue to stand strong together in NATO. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, CNN.
Hi, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you.
President Zelensky, in his address to NATO, accused Russia of deploying phosphorus munitions. I'm wondering whether NATO has seen evidence of that and what your response is or would be. And then I'm wondering, did you discuss during this meeting a permanent basing of forces in any of these countries, such as the Baltics, and abandoning the NATO-Russia Founding Act?
So we are resetting NATO's deterrence and defense for the long term, with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. We have already increased our presence in the East, and today we decided on 4 new battle groups, and the leaders agreed to task our military commanders to provide options for a long-term reset of our presence, our military posture in the eastern part of the alliance and across the whole alliance. Details will be then decided at our summit in June. But that comes on top of what we have already done. So this is long-term. We are prepared for long haul because we can already today say that the Russian invasion, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has changed our security environment for the long term. It's a new reality. It's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term. We have seen very credible reports about the use of military force against civilians, and of course this is of great concern for all NATO allies.
NBC.
Secretary General, thank you for taking my question. How do you believe NATO will respond if China begins to support Russia economically and perhaps with military supplies? And also, do you believe that there's a role to play for NATO when it comes to alleviating energy costs? And I'm talking about speaking directly to Saudi Arabia and other OPEC producers. Thank you.
So NATO allies are coordinating their efforts when it comes to also energy security, and it was also addressed in the meeting today to step up supplies, to diversify sources of supply, and also to reduce dependence on supplies from Russia. And later on today, I also participate in the G7 meeting, and of course, in different frameworks, G7 working with the EU, there are different formats where NATO allies address the need to strengthen energy security and reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. Our message to China is that they should join the rest of the world and clearly condemn the brutal war against Ukraine and not support Russia, neither with economic support or, of course, not with military support.
Okay, we'll go to Interfax Ukraine, lady in the second row. Yeah.
General News Agency Interfax Ukraine. I would like to ask you if Polish leadership put at the table today for discussion the proposal to send peacekeeping mission to Ukraine, and if yes, what kind of discussion it was, and is there some conclusion? Thank you.
As we discussed a wide range of issues, and the message is that we have to stand united. And also that we need to provide support to Ukraine, but at the same time we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict do not become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And that's also the reason why allies have made it clear that we will not deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, because the only way to do that is to be prepared to engage in full conflict with Russian troops.
Okay, Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Congratulations on your annual extension. You said in the statement that allies agreed to enhance preparedness and readiness for chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. Is that based on credible intelligence that those threats could be imminent? And how does the alliance strengthen its protection against those threats? Thank you.
So we are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Any use of chemical weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have widespread consequences and, of course, be extremely dangerous. It will affect the people in Ukraine, but there's also a risk that will have a direct effect on people living in NATO countries, because we can see contamination, we can see the spread of chemical agents or biological weapons into our countries. We also know that Russia has used chemical agents against its own opposition, and they have used it on NATO territory in Salisbury before. And we also know that Russia has facilitated, supported the Assad regime in Syria when they used chemical weapons against their own population. So this just highlights the importance of ending this war immediately, because this is a dangerous situation. And therefore we impose the sanctions, therefore we support Ukraine. Allies agreed to supply equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. This could include detection equipment, protection and medical support, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are also enhancing allies' preparedness and readiness for chemical and biological and nuclear threats. Our top military commander, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups. So we are taking measures both to support Ukraine and also to defend ourselves.
Okay, we'll go to Al Jazeera.
Secretary-General James Bays from Al Jazeera. President Zelensky, when he addressed you, recalled the fact he first spoke to you a month ago, and he says he didn't get clear answers. So this time he asked you specifically for 1% of all your tanks, for 1% of all your aircraft, for multi-launch rocket systems, anti-ship weapons and means of air defence. A very specific list. What is your clear answer?
We all listened very carefully to President Zelensky, and many of the leaders in the room have had contacts with him over these weeks. I also spoke with him, and the Ukrainian defense minister participated in our defense ministerial meeting last week. We listened carefully, and of course we took note of his very compassionate message to all NATO allies. NATO allies provide significant support to Ukraine. And we provide also lethal weapons, advanced systems, and also systems that help them to shoot down planes and attack battle tanks with anti-tank weapons, and many other types of systems, including drones. I will not go into the details of the exact type of systems we are deploying. There's close contact between NATO allies and Ukraine. But what I can say is that allies do what they can to support Ukraine with weapons so Ukraine can defend themselves. Self-defense is a right enshrined in the UN Charter. At the same time, we have a responsibility to prevent this conflict from becoming a full-fledged war in Europe involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but NATO allies and Russia. That will be more dangerous and more devastating, and I think we have to be honest about that, and that's exactly what we have been in our meeting today, and also what I say to you in the press conference now. Well, what we do is that we are delivering a lot of equipment, and that is an answer. But I will not go into the details. I don't think that's wise for operational reasons if I listed exactly what and when and how. We are delivering essential equipment to Ukraine. NATO allies have stepped up, and it's essential for the progress they have been able to make in the fight against the invading Russian forces.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I know there are many questions. I'm afraid the Secretary General needs to go to the G7 meeting, but there will be other briefings throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. Let's just sum up some of the key points he just made. First and foremost, he said at the top, we stand with Ukraine. He said that the NATO members in their meeting just now had agreed that they must provide further support to Ukraine and, of course, touched on that point that we were discussing earlier in the show, that the leaders have now approved those 4 new battle groups to be stationed in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and did mention there that this wasn't just temporary, aiming to reset NATO's defence and security position for the long term. So there's about 100,000 NATO troops across Europe right now, and mentioned that various individual member states of NATO are adding their own further help during that. By the way, I should also just mention that we've just had a statement from President Biden that was released during that press conference. One line that stands out on that is that NATO is as strong and united as it has ever been. He outlines the aid to Ukraine, the defensive aid to Ukraine that the US has been involved in, more than $1 billion in new security assistance, he says, anti-aircraft systems, anti-armor weapons, drones, and millions of rounds of ammunition. That, of course, over the course of the last month, not a new $1 billion announced today. And he says he welcomes the steps by many other allies to provide defensive support to Ukraine. And together, we, NATO, are committed to identifying additional equipment, including air defense systems, to help Ukraine. He, like Jens Stoltenberg just then, also mentioned further announcements expected and that they're planning towards ahead of the next NATO summit in June. Just going back to some of the comments from Jens Stoltenberg, he also said they have seen credible reports of military force against civilians in Ukraine, and concerned by some of Russia's rhetoric that suggests they might be preparing to use chemical weapons. He made clear that any Russian claims or accusations that the West or Ukraine have been using chemical weapons themselves are totally false. He did say that any use by Russia of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of this war. He mentioned the risk that those types of weapons could affect NATO countries, given the potential way that they might spread across borders. And he said he knows that Russia has used those sorts of weapons in the past. That was that press conference from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, just wrapped up moments ago, alongside some comments from President Biden. Of course, the NATO meetings may have started to wrap up. We still have a G7 meeting. We still have an EU meeting. So lots more going on the ground there in Brussels throughout the rest of this day. One of the first Ukrainian refugees to be matched with a family in England under the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme is spending her first day in Bedfordshire.
Yes. Hello. Hello. How are you?
This was the moment that 30-year-old Ilona Lemka met Sarah Hadley for the first time as she touched down at Stansted Airport. The pair met on Facebook and applied to the government scheme. Ilona has been speaking to Sky's Becky Cotterill about fleeing her hometown of Dnipro in eastern Ukraine and leaving her husband and family behind.
And it was really difficult because you don't understand where you're going, how long time you will be absent in your family, and how long you won't see them, not only on, I don't know, FaceTime or something like that. So it's difficult because you can help them if something happened. And you would just cry, and it's difficult, really.
Yeah, how was that goodbye with them?
родители... Ну, родители были более спокойны, конечно, чем я. Ну, они понимают, для чего это все, потому что, ну, каждый родитель волнуется за своего ребенка. Да, это тяжело, ну, морально тяжело, и неважно, сколько, наверное, времени пройдет, это просто тяжело.
Emotional footage there. There is President Biden, of course, from earlier today. We just mentioned some of those headlines from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO, who just wrapped up his press conference. A press conference is expected from President Biden later today, about 7 p.m. British time, and we did just get a statement from him following that meeting, and one of the key lines from that is that he said NATO is as strong and united as ever. He said immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we activated NATO's defence plans and NATO response force. And the United States has surged thousands of forces and additional capabilities to Europe and have welcomed the new developments by our allies. He said as well, of course, that the United States has announced $1 billion over the course of the last month in new security assistance to Ukraine. Let's get to Deborah Haynes, Sky's security and defence editor, who's in Brussels. She was in that press conference just now with Jens Stoltenberg. And Deborah, I guess relatively brief press conference, the overall tone very clear, the specific announcements perhaps relatively small.
Yes, well, they were all pre-announced as well. Like, we knew that there was going to be these four new battle groups being set up along NATO's southeastern flank. So that's in Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. That's on top of the 4 battle groups that have already been in existence since about 2015, 2016, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Crimea. And then as well, that announcement that NATO allies had agreed to reset their defence and deterrence posture. What does that mean? It basically means you're going to have more troops at higher readiness, more warships, more jets deployed within the alliance along the east. It's all about showing Russia readiness to act should the alliance be attacked. NATO goes out of its way to stress that it's a defensive alliance. It does not pose a threat to Russia, but clearly the defensive deterrence posture that NATO has had up until now has failed, given the fact that Russia decided it would go ahead with its invasion of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but one of the key grudges that President Putin has with regards to NATO is the fact that, with regards to Ukraine rather, is the fact that Ukraine has said it wants to join NATO, and that for Russia is a red line. But despite the warnings from NATO to Russia not to invade, it went ahead, it carried out that invasion, and that's why NATO is having to have a big, long look at itself and look at how it can make itself more fit for purpose to ensure that further aggression is deterred. And then we also heard language, didn't we, about the threats of a chemical attack in Ukraine. It's something that the NATO allies have been warning about the potential for. We didn't really hear any kind of consequence. We heard that there would be consequences. We heard the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg reiterate this observation that it would change the nature of the conflict, but we don't really know exactly what that would mean. It seems like allies are reluctant to set out a red line when it comes to chemical weapons. Maybe perhaps back in the Syria conflict, you remember back in 2013 when the US did have that red line for Russia ally President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, that if he were to use chemical weapons in his country, there would be consequences. He then used chemical weapons, and there wasn't the sort of intervention that many had been expected to ensure that the deterrence effect against nations, rogue nations using chemical weapons, was underlined, and that's why we're in this situation now. where we don't really know exactly how NATO would respond should Russia launch that kind of attack. Clearly, it's something they're talking about. They said about how they're giving Ukraine sort of protective equipment and training to help them defend themselves against chemical, biological, radiological, even nuclear attack. These are all horrific potentials, but all potentials that they know that the Russian armed forces have should that conflict escalate. And one final point. We heard that the Ukrainian president, he addressed remotely the NATO leaders here today. And in his address, he specifically asked for tanks, warplanes, multi-launch rocket systems, so very serious weaponry in order to help his military in their fight for survival against the Russian offensive. And the NATO Secretary General was asked directly about that request and whether or not NATO had given a clear response to that plea for help. And he didn't want to be drawn. You could get from his answer that clearly NATO is providing critical lethal aid, so that's sort of anti-tank, anti-air missiles, things like that, defensive systems. But perhaps they are not yet ready to go further and support the more offensive, more aggressive weaponry like tanks and jets. There is potentially this invisible threshold that NATO is trying not to cross, which would then see Russia regarding the NATO support for Ukraine as being effectively NATO in direct confrontation on the ground with Russia. And that would then escalate this conflict beyond Ukraine and make it much more likely that it balloons into something that everyone here seems absolutely determined to prevent, and that's a full-scale war in Europe.
Deborah Haynes in Brussels, thank you so much for that summary. Busy day, of course, of diplomacy in Brussels. We're looking at some live pictures right now of another family photo that's about to take place. It looks like it's now of the G7 members, slightly smaller group, of course, than this morning, with a couple of different attendees. We've got the Japanese flag in there. We've got Ursula von der Leyen in the background there as well. Boris Johnson was in shot just moments ago. Olaf Scholz and President Biden, Justin Trudeau in the background. And with this busy day of diplomacy in Brussels, let's now get to Mark Stone, who is there and can look ahead. Mark, we've had the press conference from the NATO meeting, G7 and EU meeting to come.
Yes, things running very, very much behind schedule. We're here in the heart of Brussels, in the EU quarter, in the Europa building, where the EU leaders will gather. They were supposed to gather about an hour ago, but they're still, most of them, those that are NATO members, still over in the NATO headquarters. And so things will get underway a little later here. They're going to have a working dinner. I think one of the key focuses here will be sanctions and will be energy. If there is a split in the European Union, and to be fair, there really hasn't been. It's been remarkably united in how it's dealt or trying to deal with the Ukraine crisis. But if there is one area of concern, then it is energy, and specifically Germany, which relies very heavily on Russian energy and has been very reluctant, with a couple of other countries, to sanction Russia's energy sector. I don't think we will see any sanctions on Russia's energy sector because of Germany's opposition. The German Chancellor has made it quite clear, as recently as yesterday, that it would literally cripple the German economy if they were to cut themselves off from Russia. There's a lesson to be learnt there, many say, about Germany's dependence on Russia. But I think what we will see, and what they will have talked about at NATO in the sidelines, and what we will get, I think, some more detail on tomorrow, is an American plan to plug the gap. So if Russian energy is cut off, then there is a gap that is plugged from countries like Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from upping the production of oil and gas, natural gas in America as well. So that is something that will be discussed here as the EU leaders meet a little later on. The American president, will be here as well. He is the only non-EU head of government who will be attending this extraordinary EU summit, as they're calling it. He'll come into this building as soon as he makes his way over from the NATO headquarters, where I think he still is.
Mark Stone, thank you so much. This is Sky News Today. Coming up, Prince William has expressed his sorrow over slavery, but stopped short of an outright apology demanded by activists in Jamaica.
Kingdom.
These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life. People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want to.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account. I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families. But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. The real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
Prince William has expressed his profound sorrow for slavery, but stopped short of the apology demanded by activists in Jamaica. Dr. Shola Moshogbamimu, lawyer, activist and author of This Is Why I Resist, joins us now. Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
How would you frame this half apology or non-apology that we heard last night from His Royal Highness? Was it sufficient or not enough?
Well, first of all, it was not an apology. That is not what an apology sounds like. And usually in an apology, you hear the word sorry, and it would go further than just words. It would be backed up with action. What we've seen Prince William do is pretty much follow the same stance that his father, Prince Charles, and the royal family have taken for many, many years. I'm talking centuries now, including the government, which is not to apologize and take responsibility for the actions that Britain took in conceiving, executing the slave trade, the actions that it took in colonizing many nations, and the atrocities that it committed in that name. And so what Prince William did by not apologizing, we're talking about a prince of the 21st century. He is, without a doubt, a product of his time. And in this time, people are clearly saying, you cannot just come to us empty-handed. And that's what Prince William and Catherine have done. They've gone to these countries empty-handed. They must have known fully well the temperature, they should have known the temperature of people in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, in Belize. They should have gone with the full intention of making amends. And that goes a long way to demonstrating the intent of the royal family and this government in righting wrongs. And that's what they failed to do.
You mentioned the government there as well. Does the responsibility to apologise for these historic wrongs lie mainly at the feet of His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge, or on others, on many more people, on all of us?
Definitely all of us, but remember that it is the royal family that started off with the conception of slave trade as a business in this country, and that its parliament executed it. And for centuries, Britain as a nation benefited from exploiting all of these nations that were colonized. It committed atrocities and genocides. It is the same Britain that apologized and paid slave owners. If it could apologize and pay slave owners, how can it not apologize and pay the slaves and descendants of the slaves? And this is what we are talking about. We are not looking, and people are not looking, whether it's activists, campaigners, or people from these nations. Nobody is looking for lip service. And that's what we're getting from Prince William. Lip service is what we are getting from the government, is what we are getting from the Queen. Remember that the Queen is meant to be head of state, which is why she's being removed now. Because when you look at what the Queen has done as head of state of these nations, I think if you were going to do a performance review on her, you would fail her. I mean, look at what happened with the Windrush generation. The Queen never stepped in to say, you must treat my subjects in this nation equally to the way you would treat my white subjects in the United Kingdom. She didn't step in to do anything for them. They're not treated equally. So how has she actually done anything on behalf of this nation? This is why they're looking to remove her as head of state. It is also why they're saying that the slave trade cannot just be swept under the carpet, because Britain is still benefiting from the wealth and resources that it exploited for many of these nations, and it helped to put Britain on the map, on the global map, as an economic power and as a military power. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it is now the time to pay reparations, and it's more than enough time for the royal family and this government to say, we are sorry.
Dr. Moshog Bamamu, thank you so much for joining us here on Sky News today. You're watching Sky News. Coming up with Sarah Jane next hour, a day of diplomacy. Western leaders meet to discuss what more they can do to help Ukraine on this month anniversary of the war.